Hola y bienvenidos al podcast 4.1 para el presente del subjuntivo. I'm Senora Stanias, and today we'll be looking at the present subjunctive. Students are going to be learning about the present subjunctive and how we use it in noun clauses. At the end of this podcast, you should be able to form the present subjunctive to express your thoughts and feelings in both written and spoken Spanish. Make sure as you're going through this podcast, you have your present subjunctive sheets with you. Pause at any time and please make sure to write down questions. We need to remember the subjunctive is not a tense, but it's a mood, just like the indicative. The tense is that we will be looking at the present subjunctive today specifically. The subjunctive is used when we want to reflect the speaker's attitude or feelings about the action or event, or states the speaker's views as uncertain or hypothetical. So there has to be that degree of uncertainty or subjective opinion. This is different from the indicative mood because that is used to state facts and express actions or states that a speaker considers real and definite. So again, we need the subjunctive when we are using multiple clause sentences and we are expressing will, influence, emotion, doubt, or denial. How do we form the present subjunctive in Spanish? We need to go first to the yo form of the verb in the present indicative. We then drop that o ending and we will replace it with the corresponding subjunctive endings. So example with hablar, the yo form hablo, take off the o, and the subjunctive, present subjunctive is que hable. Comer, que coma. Escribir, que escriba. So what are the present subjunctive endings? These are the present subjunctive endings for our AR verbs, and these are the present subjunctive endings for our ER and IR verbs. We do need to look at verbs that are irregular in the yo form. You have a list on your sheets, so please take the time to pause as needed and notice that the irregular yo forms will have that same irregularity in the present subjunctive. So conducir, que conduzca. Conocer, que conozca. Decir, que diga. Hacer, que haga. Ofrecer, que ofrezca. Oír, que oiga. Parecer, que parezca. Poner, que ponga. Tener, que tenga. Traducir, que traduzca. Traer, que traiga. Venir, que venga. And ver, que vea. Now, there is a group that has a different kind of irregularity. Those verbs that are the car, gar, and zar ending infinitives. In order to maintain that sound, we have to make sure that there is a spelling change in all verbs that end in car, gar, or zar. And I've given you some examples. So with sacar, you'll notice it changes, the C changes to a QU. With jugar, the G changes to a GU. And then almorzar, the Z changes to a C. Again, pause as needed to complete your notes. We need to look at verbs that have a stem change with them, just like we saw with jugar. When you have an AR or ER stem changing verb in the present indicative, that same stem change occurs in the present subjunctive. So some examples are AR verbs, pensar, que piense, or mostrar, que muestre. And notice that they do go back in the nosotros and vosotros form, just like they do in the present indicative. The same with entender, que entienda, and volver, que vuelva. That is true for all AR and ER stem changing verbs. IR stem changing verbs are a little bit different. If they're an IR stem changing verb, they do have that same stem change in the subjunctive, but in addition there is a change in both the nosotros and vosotros forms. So the unstressed E changes to an I and the unstressed O changes to a U, which is different from in the present indicative. So here are your examples. You have pedir, que pida, and then que pidamos. Sentir, que sienta, que sintamos. Dormir, que duerma, que dormamos. We do have to look at 5 verbs that are just irregular in the subjunctive. Again, make sure you are completing your notes. You have dar, to give, and these are the forms in the present subjunctive. Estar, to be. You have ir, to go. Saber, to know. And finally, ser, our other to be, with their forms. And please note that the subjunctive form of I, that there is or there are, is also irregular, and that would be que haya. We do need to now talk about when do we use a subjunctive. In order to use a subjunctive in Spanish, there have to be 3 criteria which are met. If all 3 of these are not met, then we don't use a subjunctive, we simply use the indicative. The first is that there has to be a dependent clause. The second is that there has to be a change in subject between the independent and dependent clause. And finally, that there must be a verb that fits into a category for using the subjunctive in the independent clause. And we'll be talking about some of those categories today. So again, you have to have a main clause, que, and then a dependent clause with a change in subject. So es importante que aprendan el subjuntivo. I'm going to go through the verbs that you need. These are all the ones that would fit into a category for using the subjunctive. Our first category is will and influence. If any of these verbs are in our independent clause, there's a change in subject, you need to use a subjunctive. And you can pause at any time to make sure you have the meanings of all these verbs. Some of them are going to be new, some of them are not. The examples that you have on your sheet, here they are in Spanish. So, necesito que consigas estas pastillas en la farmacia. El médico siempre me recomienda que haga más ejercicio. Insisto en que vayas a la sala de emergencias. Se oponen a que salgas si estás enfermo. Now, what happens if there is no change in subject? Well, the infinitive is used, not the subjunctive. So, our sentences would look like this. Quiero ir a Madrid en junio. No change in subject, no subjunctive. Prefiero que vayas en agosto. Change in subject, therefore, we need to use a subjunctive. Our next category that will require the subjunctive if there is a change in subject are verbs of emotion. Again, make sure you're pausing as you need to in order to fill in the information of what these verbs mean in English. Again, some are going to be new and some are not. Notice that ojalá is not a verb, it is an expression, but it is similar to an emotion that I hope or I wish, which is why I've included it here. So, espero que te recuperes pronto. Qué pena que necesites una operación. The final category we're going to look at today that would require the subjunctive are verbs of doubt and or denial. Again, pause as needed in order to write down the meanings. You'll notice that some of these have parentheses because some of them, obviously, if you take away that doubt, then you would be using the indicative, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But you can see that in these examples, there's doubt, potentially denial. We have to have the subjunctive. No cree que él nos quiera engañar. Ellos dudan que eso sea un buen tratamiento. Notice, however, that if you do remove that uncertainty, then the indicative must be used. So if you see these verbs, then you would need to use the indicative. I've given you that example that's voces. You can see if it's verdad, obvio, claro or cierto, evidente or seguro. Those are all certainty, those all require indicative. As in my examples. Es obvio que han estudiado. No hay duda que está en clase. This ends this podcast. Please make sure you finish the Google Voice document found below this podcast and include any questions you may have. Gracias. Hasta mañana.